I'll just put in these CIA noise-canceling earplugs, then I won't have to expose myself to that filth when I yank that girl out of there.
Then what are you gonna do?
I'll never find her in here. Well, that could have taken a lot longer.
You're coming home right now. Look, everything is fine. I'm her father.
She's not going!
You don't understand. Damn it, I said I'm her father.
Do you hear an angel?
What?
An angel possessing you? Living in your heart? Oh my God. I feel everything.
You think about greatest bands of all time, and I think, a lot of people mention the Stones and the Beatles. And if you think about it, British rock and roll was a really huge thing. It was a huge worldwide phenomenon in the 60s and into the 70s. I would say that when you talk about the greatest British artists, most of us talk about entire bands. In America, our greatest artists are really mostly individuals. You think about Bob Dylan, Stevie Wonder, James Brown, Aretha Franklin, Tom Petty. I consider, even though he had the Heartbreakers, I still consider him a solo artist. Bruce Springsteen is the same way. I consider him more of a solo artist, even though he had the E Street Band. Elvis, that's what we're talking about. America's greatest all-time artists are generally all individuals. And I find that interesting. I find that to be an interesting dynamic. What I'm here to talk about is America's greatest all-time bands. Now, I saw that Glenn Kellaway did a list of 13 of his greatest American bands, from his basement, as Glenn Kellaway does. I have a list of 15. This is actually something that I've been thinking about doing for a while now. I think it was like a conversation between me and Mazzy and Chris at the Long Cut. I think we floated the idea of maybe doing like a collaborative video on this subject. Glenn also showed his favorite albums by each artist, each band. I'm not gonna do that. I just randomly kind of grabbed albums off the shelf. I also want to clarify that none of my personal favorite bands are on this list. This is really what I objectively think are the greatest American bands of all time. So this should be great. I'm gonna love getting fucking hammered in the comments for this. At number 15, I have the Allman Brothers Band. An excellent run of albums starting in 68, 69, into the mid 70s. Of course, losing Dwayne was like a major hit to this band, but they still stayed pretty much on top of their game. I mean, Brothers and Sisters is still an excellent album. They are not a Southern rock band. They play Southern music though. A blues rock band playing music that was created in the Southern United States and aped by everybody across the world. And that's why they're the 15th greatest American band of all time. At number 14, I have the Replacements. The biggest reason why I've chosen the Replacements is because of influence. They started as pretty close to just a hardcore punk band, but they evolved from that early punk music into something more like this and Let It Be, which still has, an underlying punk attitude to it. But they really start to embrace other forms of rock and roll, a little bit more accessible sounds, but really keying in on Paul Westerberg's songwriting. One of the more influential bands on all indie rock bands that came along in the mid to late 90s into the 2000s. What was one of the more overlooked bands of the 80s has since really kind of like caught on and developed more of a cult following, finally getting their due as one of the greatest bands of the 80s. Now, along with not including solo artists in this list, I'm also not including singing groups like The Temptations, The Four Tops, The Supremes. And all of those artists and those groups are well worth mentioning in a list of the greatest American artists, musical artists of all time. But I'm trying to stick with bands, and that's why at number 13 I have Earth, Wind & Fire. Now, Earth, Wind & Fire, in my opinion, doesn't get enough credit in the broader sense of the music world for being an incredible fucking band. That horn section, the huge arrangements, the leadership of Maurice White and Philip Bailey. I mean, this was a true band, a true group. And in the 70s, had one of the more spectacular tours going in the mid to late 70s. Yeah, Earth, Wind & Fire doesn't quite get their due, in my opinion. And I have them at 13. The 13th greatest American band of all time. This one's going to cause a little bit of controversy. But at number 12, I have Nirvana. Now, yes, a very short-lived career. 3, maybe 4 albums, depending on what you call an album. And again, the biggest reason why I have them on this list, influence, importance to the music landscape. I mean, they're pretty much credited with ending hair metal. And I really, truly do believe that they did that because they did it to me. They did it to my friends. We were all listening to those shitty bands then in like middle school, in our middle school years. And then along came Nirvana and they saved us. They rescued us. At least they rescued me. At number 11, I have Creedence Clearwater Revival, a California band that sounded like they could have been from the South. Country influence, definitely a huge influence on the alt-country movement of the 90s. The last song on this album, the closing track on this album, Effigy, was covered by Uncle Tupelo on the No Alternative compilation, and that's what got me into Uncle Tupelo altogether, who is my actual favorite band. Just an absolutely unmistakable sound. When you hear CCR, you know it's CCR. They sold a ton of records, had a lot of hit singles, and were clearly one of the best bands in the 60s. At number 10, I have Sonic Youth. Probably one of the more important bands in American history, as far as I'm concerned. They didn't sell as many albums as a lot of the other bands that I've talked about, nowhere close, in fact. But they were super influential on every alternative band that came out through the 90s. Sonic Youth took bands like Nirvana, put them on their shoulders, gave them a platform to perform in front of audiences that might have never seen them. And a lot of those bands went on to be way more successful than Sonic Youth, even though Sonic Youth was pretty much like their big brother. And then, of course, longevity. Starting in the early 80s, putting out an artistic onslaught of a huge discography well into the 2000s. I'm not even like one of the biggest Sonic Youth fans. I still feel like they're so important, and that's why I'm putting them at number 10. At number 9, Sly and the Family Stone. Now, I don't own a lot of greatest hits anymore. And this one I've still held on to, because even though I have several Sly and the Family Stone standalone albums, nothing is better than this track list right here and all of these songs together. And of course, Thank You for Letting Me Be Myself Again, which was never included on an album. This is worth owning just for that song alone. I've also always said that if I could go back in time and see any band live, it would be Sly and the Family Stone. Around, 1968, 1969, around that time. Hugely diverse audience. They crossed over with hits like, Hot Fun in the Summertime and Everyday People. An incredibly important band in the social landscape of American music and politics. Probably going to catch a lot of backlash for this one, but at number 8, I have the Beach Boys. The biggest reason why I would even include the Beach Boys on this list is just because of how hugely popular they were in the early 60s, moving into the mid 60s. the way they infiltrated American culture, and also how Brian Wilson eventually evolved their sound in creating some of the most incredible masterpieces ever recorded, including Pet Sounds. But of course, there's all the hits. There's longevity too. And the only reason why I have them down at 8 is because the longer they stayed around, the less they kind of evolved, and their output, in my opinion, just kind of got worse over time. At number 7, I have the Grateful Dead. Out of San Francisco, the counterculture, Grateful Dead, jam band, Grateful Dead, country rock band, Grateful Dead. They wore a lot of hats over the years, if we're completely honest, and I think that's one of the reasons why they deserve to be on this list. But also, I mean, really, what are we talking about? It's their live show, it's their live act, it's the universe that they created through their cultish fan base. From the Mars Hotel is actually, though, my favorite studio album by them. And if I was to identify with an era of the Grateful Dead, it probably would be more of like the, 70 to 74. That's kind of like my Dead wheelhouse. At number 6, I have the Ramones. One of the more influential bands of all time, not necessarily even in their sound, but just their attitude, how iconic they were viewed by so many. They would kind of go on to do their own kind of like against the norm type of thing. Everybody in the UK is going to talk about the Damned and the Clash and the Sex Pistols and, UK punk bands and everything. But, let's talk about the proto-punk of New York Dolls, Richard Hell on Television, and then, of course, the punk of the Ramones. Pretty much where it started. A huge output, lasted for many, many years. The only reason why I have them so low is, again, because of that longevity. Over time, their output didn't really stay as strong. At number 5, I have the Byrds. Could put the Byrds a little higher if I wanted. Really kind of wrestled with this one. The only reason why I've dropped them to number 5 is because of the evolution of the lineup over the years. Had this core group stuck together, maybe we would be talking a little bit different about where they're ranked. That being said, the Byrds have everything. Hit singles, album sales, huge influence. From their folk and country rock sound to all of the jangle pop bands that they would influence into the 80s and continuing to today. The Byrds, easily one of the most important and one of the best American bands of all time, one of the best bands of all time, really. I feel like they deserve this ranking. I think some people will back me up here, and I think some people are going to think that I'm fucking crazy. But I have Parliament Funkadelic at number 4. And the biggest reason why I have them that high is because of their pure creativity. A melding of like the rock and roll of Sly and the Family Stone with the funk of James Brown and turning it into this otherworldly sound that you'd never heard before. George Clinton, an absolute genius. All of his collaborators, absolute geniuses. Bernie Worrell, Bootsy Collins. And if you listen to modern day hip hop, modern day R&B, you hear a lot of that kind of psychedelic influence that really took shape more in the 2000s, but was always there, even going back to the 90s and West Coast hip hop with Snoop and Dre and Digital Underground, but also just their influence on Prince. And a lot of these songs, if they were turned into radio edits, really would have been bigger hits, in my opinion. At number 3, I have the Velvet Underground. Now, again, another band that didn't sell a ton of records, wasn't hugely popular, didn't have many radio hits, if any, but talk about influence. One of the most influential bands of all time, no matter what country, continent, planet we're talking about. what was the saying? And I don't even remember who said it, but it was basically like, not a lot of people bought Velvet Underground records, but the people that did buy Velvet Underground records went on to start their own band. But the music that they did record together would go on to influence a lot of the bands that I've already talked about. I mean, Sonic Youth was just a continuation of this band, as were, other noise rock and, even take a band like Yo La Tengo, which kind of combined, this sound of the Velvet Underground with the noisier side of like White Light, White Heat. And I know a lot of people will go in the comments and say, I've just never gotten the Velvet Underground, and you just think the Velvet Underground is cool because you have to or whatever. Listen, I don't waste my time with music if I don't think it's great. I don't waste my time. And I think the Velvet Underground is absolutely outstanding, easily one of the most important bands of all time, and definitely the third greatest American band of all time. And this album actually is my favorite Velvet Underground album. At number 2, I have the Talking Heads. Chris Frantz, Tina Weymouth, Jerry Harrison, and of course, David Byrne. Pretty big band. Had a few hits along the way. A few hits, but mostly it was their influence on future generations. And also how they kind of celebrated their influences. Even the influences of funk and R&B, like the bands that I've mentioned before. Sly and the Family Stone, George Clinton. Huge influences on the Talking Heads. I mean, they came up through CBGBs. Not necessarily really a punk band, but at least like a punk attitude or a punk approach by, kind of going against the grain. And a lot of people will say that a lot of UK bands took American rock and roll and maybe even did it better than the Americans did themselves. And especially if we're going to say that, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones are, the two greatest bands of all time, or if you even take a band like Pink Floyd and how creative they were and how many like molds they kind of broke. Well, the Talking Heads match all of those bands' creativity, in my opinion. At number 1, REM. That's right. The boys from Georgia, the little band that could. Why are they the greatest American band of all time? I know why all of you are going to say that I'm fucking nuts, but I can make a legitimate argument for why. Let's take in all the factors that I've talked about with all of these other bands. Let's talk about influence. Huge amount of influence this band had. Did they sell records? Yes, they sold records. Not as many around this time, but around this time and after, yeah, they sold millions of records. So the album sales are there too. And then longevity. We're talking 4 decades of musical output. And were the last albums their best? Actually, the last 2 were better than the 2 that came out before it, before them. But from the debut album all the way to New Adventures in Hi-Fi, we're talking about top-rate output. But the best thing about REM was they showed everybody what could be done. You could start as this little local band, started making their records, they started to get played on college radio, and then they gained national exposure, and then they became one of the biggest bands of all time. From DIY to major label artist. And it probably will never be done again, the way the music industry exists now. But as far as album output, the quality of that output, their influence, how popular they were, to the longevity of their career, they hit all of those factors. And that's why I think they're the greatest American band of all time. I hope everybody's doing well. Maybe more clickbait to come. Who knows? I'm just having fun. I'm just feeling like talking about music these days. But anyway, see you in the next one. All right, bye.
Digital gramophone makes no sense.